What's good with y'all, man? My name is Tej, and in this video I'm going to show y'all how to make a beat for Lil Baby similar to the recent snippets for his upcoming album. And I made this beat from scratch, so I'm going to show y'all my whole process of making the sample and adding drums to it. And if you're new to the channel and you enjoy these types of videos, be sure to hit subscribe. And if you want to know the latest on anything that I'm working on, be sure to go follow me on Instagram at beatsbytej. I think I've said enough, so let's just hop into the sample. So for this beat, I chose a tempo of 164 beats per minute. These are typically faster tempos, but you can be fairly versatile with them. So you can be anywhere from like in the 140s to the low 170s. For my first melody sound, I went into Analog Lab and I got this Chroma synth preset from Prod by HZE or Prod by Hayes Analog Element Bank. So I ended up making the first two stems in just this one melody pattern. The second half of the pattern is the same exact thing as the first half, but just up by one octave. At first glance, it looks pretty complicated, but if we zoom in, similar to some of the other tutorials I've done in the past, my goal with this is I wanted to start with a pretty catchy and repetitive sounding melody. And as you can tell, it's only really just a one measure pattern, and that's just duplicated for the whole entire 8. The key that the MIDI is in for the sample is E minor. So I started by going up to the snap to grid menu here and selecting 1/3 beat. And using these grid lines, that's how I constructed my faster tempo melody. So I guess in a way this is similar to a triplet melody that you'd kind of hear in some other 4PF beats, but it's just using a different sound selection and tempo range. So I started by going with the root note of my scale, which is E, and then going up to the 7th note, which is D, and just using the 3rd, 4th, and 5th notes in the scale primarily to flesh out the rest of the melody, and then occasionally I used the 2nd note also. But for the most part, I just had the root note and then just had this descend and then kind of lead in back, and then the root note but up by one octave, so it's an E5 instead of an E4. Again, that same descend, except this one comes up from the 2nd note to the 3rd note in the scale. Once you have your repetitive melody, like I said earlier, just copy it out for the full 8 measures. So I routed that to a mixer track using Control L, and the first effect that I put on it was RC20, and I put on the Lush and Crunch Guitar 2 preset. I kept the wobble, distortion, space, and magnetic. This is just to give it a little bit of a detune vibe and also add some reverb to give the sound a little more space. And then I put in this EQ, a low cut to cut out some of the more key noises for the lower part of the melody, and then a cut in the mids to cut some of the harshness when it goes up by one octave. So for my next sound, I went into X-Band and I went to DB's distro X-Band bank and got this mixture of emotions. I turned off all the other sounds except for the ambient resonance, so you don't necessarily need this specific preset. You could just use a different ambient sound from X-Band. And for this, I was primarily using the root notes of E and C. Relative to their scale degrees, this is the 1st and the 6th note in the scale, which is pretty typical for Lil Baby beats. And I just built chords based off of the notes in the scale. So we have E minor here, which is the 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes in the scale, and then C major. So it's just using the relative 1st, 3rd, and 5th notes. But really, this is just the 5th, 1st, and 3rd note in the scale. And I just threw in a couple accent notes here just to make it sound like it has a little more movement to it. For effects on that, I put on this pretty steep bandpass EQ just so I could get like the mids of this and fill out the sound a little more. And then I put on some Portal. The specific preset is the Samurai preset in DB's distro kit. So once I had the main melody and the pad down, I opened up Keyscape and got this rich ballad piano pattern. You could just use whichever piano VST that you have. And this follows the same progression of bass notes as the last pattern, where we have the root note and then the 6th note in the scale. And then there's also these 2 notes here, which are meant to transition between the 2 sets of notes and just make it sound a little bit more unique. For my filler notes, I'm using the 3rd and the 7th notes in the scale. For effects, I just put a low cut on it to give the sample a little bit of room in the sub frequency range. And once I had my bass piano melody for my last sound, I went back to Analog Lab to the Analog Elements preset bank, and I got this light and darkness pad preset. And for this pattern, I just copy and pasted the notes that I had from the previous one and put it a few octaves up. And the only thing that's different about this is that we have the relative fifths to the root notes. So how you put those in is you just go to your root notes, highlight them, and then just duplicate them by shift clicking and then dragging them up by 7 half steps. And similar to the second melody, this was mainly meant to just fill out the sound a little more. And for effects on that pad, I got the Dark World preset from the Grain Synthesis Portal Bank, and then I put some default halftime on it. So once I'd finished all the melodies, I rendered each of the stems out as audio clips. I arranged the loop and rendered it out as an audio file, and then I imported it into a new project file where I did the drums. So hopping into the drums, once I had the sample imported into the new project file, I set my project tempo to 164, the same as the loop, and then I opened up the audio file settings for the sample, and I changed my mode to stretch, and I pitched it up by 300 cents. So the finished render of the sample was in D sharp minor, which makes this in F sharp minor. So once I had the sample manipulated, I arranged the stems to my liking, and the first sound that I got was this clap. So the clap hits on the third beat of every measure, and I have a few claps on the off beats too on the even measures just to make it sound a little more interesting. And I also adjust the velocity on those just so there's a little bit of bounce and some variation between them. Next, I put in this hi-hat sound. Jumping into the pattern, it's pretty similar to a two-step, and I believe for all the rolls, I used the 1/3 step snapping under the snap to grid menu, and I just threw in all these rolls using the paintbrush tool. Next, I put in my first of 2 snare patterns. The first snare sounds like this. So pretty typical sounding snare. So I had the snare hit on a couple off beats here, and then just after a couple of those claps. And then at the end, I just put in a snare roll using the 1/2 step and 1/3 beat snapping. So for my second snare pattern, I got this sound. This just layers with the claps on the even measures. So after I laid down my 2 snare patterns, I opened up this open hat sound. It's close to a standard trap open hat. I just turned up the out knob, and this is mainly meant to layer with the 808. And for my last sound, I got my 808. This sounds pretty similar to a spins, but I went to the pre-computed effects and turned the boost up a little bit, and also turned up the out knob a little bit so that it decays a little faster. So this is the first one, and as you can tell, it just follows those bass piano notes from the sample, but adjusted to the respective key. And I also tried to keep these 808 patterns pretty simple because I did a lot with the melodics and the rest of the drums already. And here's the second pattern. It's pretty much just a simplified version of the first one. So that's going to do it for me. Hope you all enjoyed the video and found it pretty helpful. Leave any recommendations or feedback you may have in the comments. And that's going to do it for me. I'll see y'all next time. Peace.
Roll up, Tess.